Who's asking questions? Both. Okay, yeah. All right.
So first off, we have some warm-up questions to ask you to just get to know you better on a personal level.
Okay.
So if you could travel anywhere in the world, where would you go?
Pitcairn Island. Do you know where that is?
Not
Anybody
sure
know where that is? South Pacific. And the reason is that I'm fascinated by the population there. Pitcairn Island was first settled by the mutineers on the Bounty. Do you remember the movie Mutiny on the Bounty? When they mutinied against the captain, they couldn't go back to England, so they had to escape. They went to Pitcairn Island. Today, the people there are the descendants of these mutineers, and I want to go there.
Camera is there.
Oh, okay. Can you move to the front, please? Yeah. Thank you.
Camera, can you move to this side, please?
That's pretty cool. Have you been there before?
Of course not. That's why I want to go. Not yet. It's not easy to get there.
What is your favorite book or movie?
Advice have you received in your life?
Either learned through your own experiences or given by other people.
Okay, I learned, actually mainly from my father, that the most important thing in life is to share and to give back. Because I watched how he lived his life, and I want to, and he was the greatest example for me. I wanted to do what he did, which is, he was very successful in his own way as a businessman and as a community leader, and he always gives back. And he always cares about the workers, the people who are sort of at the bottom in society. He always helps them. And I think that's the most important thing in life.
Yeah, I think those are some pretty great words to live by. Yeah. So you talked a little bit about wanting to go to the island in South Pacific. Is there anything else on your bucket list that you want to achieve sometime in the near future?
A lot. There's a lot. There are so many places in the world that I haven't been. And I love to travel and learn. I have friends who've said, well, you've been everywhere. No, I haven't. I can think of a million places I haven't been, and I still want to do it, as long as I'm able. Okay.
Amazing. There's always more things to accomplish in life, and we really love hearing that inspiration from you. And now we do have some pre-prepared questions that the audience has wanted to ask you, so we're just asking those to you right now. We'd like to start off by asking, you're very accomplished. You have been a fashion designer, entrepreneur, senator, chancellor. Were you born with those talents, or is it something you acquired later on?
I guess you have to be born with certain abilities, and the rest you acquire out of interest. And I think it's because I like people. So I do a lot of things in the public. Also, with fashion design, I have always loved beautiful things, and I would say I started painting way before I could read or write. I would think around 4 or 5. I used to do watercolors, and I was always inspired by sunrises and sunsets. I don't know why, but so I've always loved colors, and I've always loved beauty, and one of my favorite pastime was drawing and painting. So that's sort of, and for me, fashion is wearable art. I don't believe in fashion that doesn't work. I always design things that actually work and look beautiful.
Amazing, thank you so much.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot to be said about the importance of form and function and the
Yes.
way that things might look and how they might have utility. So my next question is, what is the most interesting position that you've held so far? So as Matthew mentioned earlier, you've had a ton of different occupations, different roles. What do you think would be your favorite or the most unique that you could speak to?
I actually believe they're all unique, but probably the most interesting and the one I learned the most was as a senator, because I was thrown into this political world that I had never been in, and there was a lot to learn, and I also learned a lot about Canada. So that would be and it was the most challenging too.
Yeah, definitely. And we also want to touch up on that in the fact, like, you've done a lot of activism and support for inclusivity and diversity. What first got you started, and why is it so important to you?
Well, I'll go back to, learning from my father. It was the same thing. And I guess when I look back, I've always been there for the underdog. And to me, in Canada, it's the most important is for all of us to get along, because just look at the hall today. It's like United Nations. We all need to make friends. And that, to me, is extremely important. So I'll do everything I can to work for it. Yeah.
So you talked about favoring the underdog. There are a ton of minorities, including East Asians, South Asians, different Asians here today. What is your favorite way to celebrate Asian Heritage Month after 23 years of it being in action?
My favorite way is like today, talking to young people. And I do that. I've continuously been doing that. I just want to mention that when I was in the Senate, I initiated an event called Era 21 Networking Breakfast for Young Canadians. Now, I work with the Ottawa Carleton School Board for grade 11 and grade 12 students, and I held this breakfast once a year in May. So the entire parliamentary restaurant was filled with high school students, and a few principals, and if there's room, maybe a couple of school board members as well, and some teachers. And my office, of course, have to do a lot of work to get successful young, visible minority, or just ethnic minority people to come and speak to the students, and the students can ask them questions. And I was very fortunate to have RBC paying for the breakfast, because it was a wonderful breakfast for all the students.
Sounds like a really good experience there.
And one thing I want to mention too, the students had to get up very early because they have to line up to go through security. So, like 5:30 and they're there lining up because we start on the dot of 7.
Wow, that's a really proactive group of students. That's amazing. Okay, so you've done a lot of work towards making Canada more inclusive and diverse, right? So I want to ask you, can you comment on the progression we've made that you've seen throughout the past years, like how far we've come, and what are your comments on that?
I think we're doing very well, and this is a topic I'll touch on when I speak. So I won't carry on from there.
Okay, perfect.
Okay?
We'll talk about this.
Yeah.
Can't wait. So another question I have is, what are your favorite examples of Asian American works that help to celebrate increase inclusivity and representation here in North America?
Can you repeat that question? Asian American what?
What are your favorite ways or favorite examples of Asian American, so Asian Canadian or Asian American works that help to celebrate diversity and representation?
I can't pinpoint on any, but I think actually society is very much influenced by films, by what's on TV, and by books. So I think those are very important, but there are lots of works, a lot of them.
Okay, perfect. And we also know you've been one of the active supporters in changing the Canadian national anthem. Could you talk, like, what was the inspiration, like, why you wanted to change it, and just give us an overview of your motivations behind that?
I don't know whether many of you would remember what the wording was in All Thy Sons command. That exclude a lot of us here as women, and according to my knowledge, more than 50% of Canadian population is female. So whenever that national anthem never made any sense to me. Why sons? But then I found out, when I was working on the amendment, I found out that the words, that wasn't the original wording. It was changed to thy sons around the First World War because the government wanted the young men to join the war. It was around 1913, around that time, 1914. That was when it was changed to thy sons. And I thought, okay, it's time to change it again, to make it more inclusive. And at the same time, when I entered the Senate, I received a lot of letters and emails from Canadians asking to have it changed. Now, I don't know whether other senators received these requests. I have no idea. Why me? I also don't know. But they kept coming. And there were groups that keep asking me to do something, and that they have petitions supporting me. So there I went. And it was a lot of hard work. Now, I want to say that I didn't manage to do it, but I did a lot of work. I tabled 2 bills. In fact, at the beginning, I thought maybe there's an easier way to amend the national anthem. And I spoke to Sheila Copps, who was the Minister of Canadian Heritage, and I said, Sheila, just look into it. Is there an easier way to change the wording? And then she came back to me and said, well, when the national anthem came into being, it was by legislation. So in order to change it, to amend it, it has to be by another legislation. So putting through a legislation, a private member's bill, is a huge amount of work. But I did it. And the first time, Parliament prorogued, so debates had to end. Everything is gone. Then you start again, and I introduced the second time. Again, Parliament prorogued, and at that time, I almost got it through the Senate because I had 100% support in committee. But then it happened, and then, you know, as you all know, within a very short time, Harper joined the government, and I knew I wouldn't have any chance of getting it through. So what happened was that I wasn't going to give it up. So I handed it over to a friend, Senator Nancy Ruth, who supports me, who was very supportive of the bill. And I asked my office to copy absolutely everything I have and to send it to her office. So I said, okay, you take it over from here because you are a conservative senator. And she did. She worked very hard. And then, but she was constantly fighting against her own party. A lot of them don't support it. And then finally, she reached 75. So the day a senator reaches 75, she becomes history. She's no longer a senator, she's out. And so she couldn't do any more work, but before then, she handed it over to Senator Francis Rankin, who is an NDP. So finally, Francis had it put through third reading. Now, before that, all that happened, Mario Bélanger, before he passed away, he was an MP. He put it through, and it passed House of Commons. And I still remember the day we were up at the cottage, and Nancy Ruth texted me and said, "Vivian, it passed." So I returned my text saying, "When are you going to introduce it in the Senate? Because a bill has to pass both houses." She said, "This evening." And she really worked at it, but she was disappointed. She couldn't get it through, but Francis did. And of course, that happened in February 2018, and we had a huge celebration. But what I want to say is, when you want something done, very often you need cooperation. In fact, all the time you need cooperation, you need friends, and you make friends. That's how you get along in life. And to have that national anthem finally changed the words to "in all of us," those were my original wording, by the way. It was my bill. It needs 3 women crossing party lines, 3 different political parties to get it done. So just remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's pretty amazing that you were able to unite people from completely different political parties all for one common goal of inclusivity and diversity. So that brings me to my next question. So you've attended a diverse range of different educational institutions. So University of Toronto, McGill, Seneca, just to name a few. What do you have to say for a time like today where people are typically expected to only attend university as a post-secondary institution? And what do you have to say about that and why it's important to take on different career paths?
Well, to me, when you think when a child is very young, that child has to go to kindergarten and to grade 1. To me, entering university or community college when you're in your late teens is like starting all over again. Getting an undergraduate degree to me, is like going to grade 1 all over again for an adult. And that is just the beginning of your education. So keep going. It doesn't have to be a university. It can be a technical college. But keep learning. And that doesn't end. Even no matter what degree you get, keep learning in your life, because that's very important.
Thank you. I think learning is something that's ongoing through our entire life. It's a process. And that brings us to our final question. A lot of us in this room are still in high school and figuring our paths out.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give to your 17-year-old self?
Myself?
Yes.
Keep learning. And I still do. Every day I keep learning, even at my age. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
So now you've all heard us ask the Honorable Vivian Poi some questions. We're going to allow her to say a few words that things that she wants to share with the rest of us today.
Okay. So I'll speak now, okay?
Yeah, floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, my young friends. It's delighted to be here today. Seeing all of you reminds me of the time when I first arrived in Canada. I had just turned 18 and coming to a new country to enter university. By the way, Matthew, I didn't come as a small child. I think you mentioned, right, that I came with my family to Canada. My family never came. It was just me. When I was 7 months old, Hong Kong was invaded by the Japanese, and our family went into China as refugees. So I know, and it's amazing, I still remember, I was in China for 4 years. I remember what it was like as a refugee. So I am very understanding of what happens when refugees try to come into Canada, because I remember a lot of things, even though I was very young. But I came, in 1959, I came here to university by myself. Okay, my family never immigrated here. At that time, Canada was a white country, and there were very few ethnic minorities. I think you're so lucky to live in multicultural Canada. It is so much more interesting, but multiculturalism is not without its problems. I'm sure you all know that, but I'll also come to that later. As a historian, having written my PhD thesis on Canadian immigration, I have a clear understanding of Canada's progression from a white country to a multicultural one. When I was in the Senate, one of my best friends from the diplomatic community was the Swedish ambassador to Canada, Ingrid Eiermark. She said to me one day that she didn't understand how Canada could have so many different races living side by side, and it worked. But then that was 20 years ago. Since then, Sweden has also taken in many ethnic minorities as immigrants and refugees, and they are managing well too. Canada has a lot of land and a small population. Even though it has always been an immigrant country, it used to only welcome those from Western countries. I won't bore you with details, but immigration policy changed in the 1960s, which gradually welcomed immigrants from other parts of the world. Restrictions on immigration of Asians were the last to be lifted. Since then, Asians gradually arrived in Canada. We all knew that it was a great influx that, like places like Hong Kong, East Asia, and Southeast Asia in the 1980s. Many of your parents and your families might have immigrated to Canada then. In the 1980s, I was working as a knitwear designer with my own retail and wholesale business. One day, World Monitor, a US magazine, called to ask for permission to take my photo for their cover because they were covering Asian immigration to Canada in their forthcoming issue. I told them I've been in Canada for many years, and since I was not a new immigrant, I was not suitable. However, they insisted and ended up taking my headshot in my boutique in Yorkville. Your parents or grandparents would remember the backlash against those rich Asians who pushed up real estate prices, who owned monster homes and drove expensive cars. As in the past, xenophobia was fanned by the media against newcomers. You may wonder how I ended up in the Senate of Canada. I come from a family which believes in public service, so it was natural that I got involved in my community. In the spring of 1998, out of the blue, I received a call from the Prime Minister's office. Now, Parliament Hill was totally new to me, and I had never met Prime Minister Chrétien. In fact, he had to be introduced to me just before he introduced me in National Caucus. That was how, and I didn't realize he was so tall. To make a long story short, I was appointed to the Senate of Canada, making me the first in Canadian history as someone of Asian descent to be appointed. At the time, I wondered why it had taken so long since Asians have been in British North America for a few hundred years. Being the only Asian in the Red Chamber was a huge challenge with a very steep learning curve, but I was up to it. I wasn't going to let Asian Canadians down. First thing, I had to learn how to survive in Ottawa. All the skills I had accumulated in my life came in handy. I made friends and found those who could work with me. That was how I managed to achieve my goals. When I got to the Senate, I saw that there were senators of different backgrounds, but no Asian, with me as the only exception. We are intelligent, hardworking, and had helped to build this country like other groups. But our cultures teach us to keep our heads down, study hard, work hard, and stay out of trouble. That's why we could be ignored. What we needed was to be heard, and we need to raise our profile. When I was appointed, I wanted to focus on two important issues: to improve the status of Asian Canadians and of Canadian women. Soon after I was sworn in the Senate, appeals from Canadians showed me that I was on the right track. One was to amend the national anthem to make it inclusive of all Canadians that I just mentioned, and the other was to raise the profile of Asian Canadians. We're celebrating Asian Heritage Month, so I'm going to speak only on that right now. My family has always been proud of our Chinese heritage, so it is in my DNA. In my maiden speech in the Senate, I spoke about the early Chinese who came to British North America, most of whom were poor laborers. In the 19th century, unless you were poor, you wouldn't have left the comfort of your home anyway. These migrants were discriminated because they were poor and were considered depraved and dirty. However, in the 1980s, those who came to Canada were considered too rich and too well educated. They drove up real estate prices and competed for Canadian jobs. Rich or poor, xenophobia against Asians is always there, even though sometimes it's hidden below the surface. Celebrating Asian Heritage Month would be the key against xenophobia. But why the month of May besides it's a beautiful time of the year? The celebration of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders has taken place in May in the US since the time of President Jimmy Carter. This has migrated to Canada in a small way within the Chinese Canadian communities, and I was invited to attend one of these events in Calgary in May 2000. On my return to Ottawa, I had my staff look into the status of Asian Canadians in regard to the federal government. There were a few Asian MPs in the House of Commons, but no attempts had ever been made to declare Asian Heritage Month, despite the fact that Black History Month had been celebrated by the federal government for quite a few years. My staff were horrified that Asian Canadians were not even mentioned in Canadian Heritage website. That was how invisible we were. So I took it upon myself to make Asian Heritage Month happen. And I believe it should belong to all Asian Canadians. I tabled a motion in the Senate in 2001, and debates commenced. I want to mention that a motion can be passed and it becomes a fact for the federal government, not unlike a legislation that has to be passed two houses. Motion only needs to pass one house. I had a lot of support, but not all. Some senators were really confused by my description of the extent of Asia, and they didn't realize that Asia is the largest continent in the world. One senator from New Brunswick who tabled a motion for the declaration of Acadian Day asked me why I asked for a month while he only asked for 1 day. I said because there were so many of us in Canada. To make a long story short, my motion passed just before we rose for our Christmas break in 2001. The real work began when Senate resumed sitting the following year. To make the motion effective, I needed Canadian heritage on side. I was fortunate that Sheila Copps was the minister and I worked well with her. She was very supportive, but it was a bit of a struggle with the staff at Canadian Heritage. Anyway, the hard work culminated in the official declaration by the federal government at a gala reception in the Museum of Nature in May 2002, well attended by Canadians across the country. Since then, it has been celebrated on Parliament Hill every May, and Asian Heritage Societies sprung up from coast to coast. The enthusiasm showed me how much such a declaration was needed in our country. I was invited to speak in many community events and have made a lot of friends from different backgrounds and heritage over the years. Even though I retired from the Senate 12 years ago, I'm still well remembered and get invited to many events. In fact, I attended the National Convention of Asian Heritage Month Societies in Winnipeg in 2022, held in the Museum for Human Rights. I joined in the powwow at the beginning of the event. Lots of fun to see old friends and to make new ones. And I want to mention that the Asian Heritage Month Societies some of them have really neat names, like Explore Asian, Imagine Asian, and Ase Asi in Montreal. Really wonderful names. Despite the anti-Asian setback during the COVID pandemic, the significance of Asian Heritage Month keeps growing to become an important part of the Canadian fabric. And the pride of being of Asian heritage is celebrated in so many aspects of Canadian life, such as what we're doing here today. In 2016, the Senate celebrated the 15th anniversary of the passage of my motion in a gala event. I was contacted and was told that if I were not there, there would be no celebration. And I was asked to choose a day in May. It was a huge and lovely event. I was presented with a plaque by the Speaker of the Senate, George Fury, an old Senate friend. When I saw the number of Asian Canadian senators on the stage that day, I felt the greatest satisfaction that I had done something right. May in Canada is the month to celebrate the contributions of those of Asian heritage with all Canadians. It's a time to make friends and build a better country for future generations. The annual celebration of Asian Heritage Month by the federal government is a constant reminder to the stakeholders in Ottawa that each one of us is a worthy citizen of Canada. In 2001, I planted a seed in fertile soil, and the next generation had nurtured it. The seed has grown into a healthy tree. Now it is up to your generation to fertilize it and protect it, so that it will grow big and strong and bear fruit. Because you and future generations are the beneficiaries. Thank you.